Okay, so I'm with Andrew Harvey, the author of Tucker and Me. Andrew, how are you this afternoon?
I'm doing great, Raymond. Thanks for interviewing me today.
Hey, so one of the questions I had is, you were a cop for 25 years and lots of cop stories, but you really chose to write about your childhood. Why is that?
Well, my cop stories were pretty crazy, but my childhood, I think, was even crazier. And I think they actually make for better stories than the stories I had on the job. Those were good. But I think for me, my childhood was very, very unique because of what happened. And I've been telling those stories about my childhood for probably 40 years now. And often people ask me, how long did it take you to write the book? And I say 40 years because I've really had those stories germinating in my mind for 40 years. I've told the stories, people seem to enjoy them, they laugh. And oftentimes they say, you really should write those down. And I finally got to the point where I realized maybe they're right. Maybe I should write them down. And I did. And that resulted in the book, and I'm pretty happy with it.
So the key theme is the juxtaposition between a Southern California really surfer boy and perhaps a Southern gentleman being raised. How was it different as a child going back and forth between those two worlds?
Well, the two worlds culturally are obviously very different, particularly if you look into the 1960s in Los Angeles versus the 1960s in the Deep South, for a lot of different reasons. Very, very different. But even had they not been as different as they were, it still would have been very difficult because you're transitioning from living with your mother for 11 months of the year with one particular lifestyle, one particular set of demands, rules, regulations, so on. And you're transitioning for 1 month or so out of the year to a completely different lifestyle, completely different rules, completely different person. I started those trips when I was probably 6 years old, and certainly I knew my father, I knew who he was, but I really didn't know much more than that. He had remarried, and I had met that woman, but I didn't really know her either. And so my first trip there was kind of like landing on foreign soil, and I really didn't have my bearings. So yes, the two cultures were very different, but even had they not been, it would have still been a very, very difficult transition for a young boy. And to say that they didn't baby me would be an understatement. Pretty much it was just, well, why don't you just go out and play? And we'll call you when we need you. And that wasn't very often. So it was hard for a lot of different reasons. But in the end, it made for some good stories.
And it also seems that when you were living in California for those 11 months, there was much more contact with, family activities, whereas with the other family that you live with in the summertime, you seem to be left to your own devices quite a bit.
Very much so, and that was very difficult initially because I didn't know anybody there. It's not like they took me around in the neighborhood and introduced me, well, this is Tommy and he lives here and, maybe you could play with him. Nothing, literally nothing. As best as I could tell, they lived their lives exactly the same way when I wasn't there as when I was there. And so I really was left to my own devices, and I'm not whining about it. That's just a factual thing. And over the years, my devices got pretty good because I did acquire some friends there and do some things. But it was tough because what I thought as a 6-year-old boy was, I'm going to go to this foreign environment. I'm going to be with my dad. And we're going to make up for lost time. For those 11 months where I didn't see him, we're going to have a month of concentrated father-son time together. And I didn't know what that really meant, but I kind of thought that would be what we would do. That was not what we did at all. Not at all. In fact, in the 10 years or so that I made trips back there in the summer, and I talk about this story in the book, it was a short jaunt to Stone Mountain, we never did anything as father and son in the whole 10 years. It was always the three of us, and it was just them doing the things that they would typically do. They'd go to Waffle House for breakfast, so I would go. And they'd go visit some business clients, so I would go to visit business clients. What could be better than that for a 6-year-old boy to go and visit business clients? And we just never really did anything along those lines. And I was disappointed by it then, and I'm disappointed by it now because I kind of thought the whole purpose for that was for me to spend time with my father and make up for those 11 months, but it just didn't play out that way. So I created my own world.
In your book, you don't back away from really examining the characters, particularly your mother, your father, and some of the others. Most of them are deceased, but some of them are still alive. Did that cause any special problems with you? The fact that some people you're going to write about are still living?
Huge problems, but in two different ways. The ones that are deceased, I have the right to use their names and write about them however I see fit. But just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean that's what you should do. We're talking about my mother, my grandmother, my father, other people. They're no longer here to defend themselves, for lack of a better word, to provide their accounting of how they saw things. So although I certainly have the right to tell my own story, and I make no apologies for it, I was very sensitive to people who have passed on because I think they deserve that. And that was a challenge. Now, the other challenge on the other side, the people that are still alive, I fictionalize their names so I can write about them as I choose. But even that said, these are still friendships and family relationships that I hope to maintain. And when you're writing about things in authentic ways, including warts and all, that can be very challenging. How much do you write authentically versus how much do you want to insulate the friendship and the family relationship from going onward? I did the best I could to balance those two, but the bottom line, in my view, is if you're going to write a memoir, it has to be authentic. If it can't be authentic, warts and all, there's no point in writing it. But I did my best to be respectful to all concerned, both those that are still here and those that are gone.
Sometimes in the book you flash a little forward as far as editorial context. And that also seems to help with looking at the past through present lenses. Is that something you thought about? In other words, you're going to talk about things that are happening in the Deep South or even in Los Angeles 50 years ago when things were substantially different. How did you work to portray them so that also was authentic and yet understandable?
That was also a challenge, as you might imagine. I tried to write it authentically, but also to set the context, because people that live today, particularly younger people, I think, tend to think that the way things are now, oh, well, that's probably how it always was. And that's not even close to being true. Many examples, the most obvious, are racial issues. People now think, oh, we have racial divisions and we have all these things, and we do, but not like was the case back then in the Deep South. There's always been racism, but now racism is in no way appropriate in society, and everybody agrees on that, at least publicly. Believe it or not, back in those days, it was absolutely socially acceptable to be racist. In fact, if you were not, that would have been socially unacceptable. And that's a very difficult thing for people nowadays, particularly younger people, to get their mind around, to really understand how could that have even been possible. And yet it was. And I put forward some examples of that in the book in some graphic terms, and I also support it with some online videos of some of those people that still remain to this day. And you can watch those videos and say, oh, I guess he wasn't kidding. But I think it was very important to set the context, because it doesn't excuse people's behavior. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I think every person is rightly judged within their own time. And I did try to set the context for that, both in Los Angeles and in the Deep South. Without excusing what anybody did, that's for the reader to decide.
In following in some of these cultural issues that have changed over time, is that like a larger look at what you experienced as a child, going back and forth between cultures?
I think it is. And I think although my childhood was not necessarily one I would have wished for anybody else. But the reality of it is, the challenging stories are the ones that tend to make the best stories. And I had some serious challenges. And just as some children now grow up bilingual, they grow up in a home where two languages are spoken, and they're fluent in both of those languages very comfortably. I think the same might have been true with me. I had to grow up concurrently in two different cultures. And as a result of that, I am very fluent in Southern culture, and I'm very fluent in Los Angeles culture. So if you were to send me out to a Hollywood event of some sort, and you were to also send me out to a Tucker, Georgia backyard barbecue, those are two very different events with very different people involved, but I actually believe I would be equally comfortable at either one. And there's probably not too many people that can say that, but it was because I was raised concurrently in those two different cultures at the same time. It was hard at the time, but I think in the end it gives me an advantage in that I can see more than just the one culture that typically people are able to see. They're only able to see their own. I grew up seeing multiple cultures. I think as a result of that, that broadens my perspective a little bit more than most.
What stories hit the cutting room floor?
Well, those are the stories that I can't tell you, for starters. Not as many as you might think. Most of the stories when I wrote these, each chapter I probably wrote within 2 or 3 hours. Now that's pretty quick to write a chapter that's somewhat finished. But I think that was because I had been thinking about and telling these stories for so long that when I finally started to actually write them down, they just kind of poured out of me. So there really wasn't as much as you might think, maybe in a normal book, of things that got edited out. The things that did get edited out were more in my mind than on paper. And the things I edited out were things that I felt weren't germane to telling my story, maybe something that I felt was a little too harsh or a little too private or a little too unfair to someone that maybe is no longer here to set the record straight as they saw it. So the stories that I started out intending to tell, I pretty much told those stories. So in comparison to the other books I've written, there's a lot less that ended up on the cutting room floor, so to speak, than there would in a normal book. And I just think that was because I was thinking about these stories for so long.
I think the inverse to that is, now that you have the finished product there and you've been able to hold it in your hand, is there something that you wish you had included?
That's a great question. Every once in a while, there will be a story that somehow pops up in my mind. And I think to myself, wait a minute, I didn't include that in the book. Did I remember it? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. And it's an odd kind of a Twilight Zone experience. You would think, well, you wrote this book, and of course everything that you remember is in there that you wanted to tell about. But even to this day, there are things that pop into my mind where I go, wait a minute, I don't think I remembered that when I wrote the book. So I think I remembered about 99% of things, but I think there is still 1% floating around in my mind where for whatever reason, it just didn't bubble to the surface at the time I was writing it. But those would be much lesser stories. There were no prominent critical stories that would have happened to because I've been telling these stories for so long. But every once in a while I'll have something happen and say, I kind of forgot about that.
So the book really begins about 50 years ago and goes forward for 10 years. So everyone at the time you're interacting with, say your pals that you're around in Georgia, or your brother, is an adult at the time and therefore deceased. Of those people you wrote about, those adults, who would you most like to hand a copy to?
Another great question. Well, I guess I would have to say probably my father. And the reason is that the book is called Tucker and Me. So yes, it is a childhood memoir and it talks about my life in total. But the heartbeat of the book is my time in Tucker, which was much more limited than my time in Los Angeles. But I think those stories probably made for the best stories. And I think I'd probably most like to hand it to my father, not so much as an in-your-face kind of thing, but I would love for him to have a way to have experienced what happened during then through my eyes, because he certainly didn't experience it through my eyes. And quite candidly, I don't think he would have cared to experience it through my eyes during those times. He was a very self-involved individual. But were he still alive now, he would be obviously much, much older. And I think maybe now he would have an appreciation of what happened back then and maybe how things were a little more difficult for me integrating into that home than he would have ever given thought to. So I think probably my father.
I think the companion to that question is naturally the reaction of the people who are still alive, that are characters in the book. What is some of the reaction?
Well, there's some of them that don't know the book is out.
Surprise.
And that's for tactical reasons. Ultimately, they will know that the book is out because I'm not going to hide it from anybody. But when a book first comes out, that's a bit of a delicate time So there are some that were written about in the book that don't necessarily know it yet. But their names were fictionalized, so no one will know who they are other than themselves. And if they choose to share the book with others, hey, that's me, that's fine. And if they choose not to, that's good as well. There is one story I'll share with you along those lines that I think is a good one. My first girlfriend, I talked about in the book when I was very young. The reason I talked about that story is because it's a good story about how my mind worked. And my mind worked differently than other kids' minds work. Not necessarily better or worse, just differently. And that's why I classify myself as a little bit of the problem child. But this girlfriend, we were together maybe a month or so, something like that. I haven't talked to her in 40 years, as you would expect that I wouldn't have talked to her. I tracked her down, and I reached out to her, and you're always hoping, well, gee, does she even remember me? She did remember me. And I said, you're not going to believe this, but I've written this memoir, and there's a story in it about you, and I'd like to send it to you. And I did. I sent her the book. And she had a reaction I've had that's comparable to other people, is her eyes get kind of big. When you hear that you've written a memoir, people's eyes get big because their immediate thought is, wait a minute, what is he going to say about me? And she even shared with me one of her fears, and she said, I really hope I was nice to you back then, because she doesn't remember necessarily. And I said, you don't have anything to worry about. You were very nice to me, and you're remembered in the book very fondly. But that's not necessarily the case with all of them, but for her it was. And I thought it was a good closing of the loop. I wanted her to read that little story about us and experience it from my perspective, because she never had the ability to experience it from my perspective. She only experienced it from her perspective. And now she knows my perspective. And I even put in the book, I classify her name, it's fictionalized in the book as Donna. I even put in the book, Donna, if you're reading this, I hope you remember these times as fondly as I do. And I think and hope that she does.
The remembering, living stories, the process of growing, the process of remembering and retelling, much different than once you get it written down.
Yes.
Once it's written down, it changes for you and also you yourself. How did this book, and I'm not saying was it a cathartic experience necessarily, but was it a growth experience for you to write this down?
100% growth experience. So much so that I would almost recommend everyone write a memoir of their childhood, because it's amazing how much it teaches you about yourself. Things where something happened, you realize, well, wait a minute, what was really happening there? What was really going on? Well, I experienced everything through the eyes of a child, and those experiences have been seasoned by many decades of memory. And now I'm reviewing those experiences in my mind through the eyes and experience of the mature man. So that really burnishes what happened in a very different way. Granted, my memories may not be as pristine as I hope that they are, but now I've got the experience to look back on those things and make sense of them to the extent that they can make sense. There's certain stories I tell in the book, I could think about it for the next 200 years, and what was done would never make sense. There's a story in the book, painful story to tell, but it had to be told, about how my father held me at gunpoint for closing the car trunk too hard, in his view. Well, you and I could talk about that for the next 50 years and try to say, well, gee, I wonder what, there's no way you can explain the inexplicable. So the book is funny, it's whimsical, it's all those things, but there were some harrowing things also in there. And that's just part of real life. Everybody experiences those kind of things. But for me, those are the kind of things I remember and have processed through. And I remember many of them like it was yesterday. And oftentimes I'm the only one alive that was present during those things. So the writer gets the final word. Good, bad, or indifferent. The writer gets the final word. And the final word was mine in this case. But I sometimes have thought to myself, what if I could go back in time, 50 years, and have somebody tell those people, hey, you better really watch what you're doing, because that little boy right there, he's going to write all this down in a book one day. They would have never believed it, not in a billion years. But even if I had told them that, or somebody had told them that, I don't think they would have changed their behavior one bit. I really don't. They lived their lives the way they wanted to, and it was kind of back in those days. We're the adults. We're in charge. We'll do what we want, and you just go to your room, keep quiet. Very different than the child-centered homes that occur nowadays. So this is a very different time. And I think that's important for people to know also, that homes weren't always child-centered as they are now. They used to be parent-centered. And we could talk all day long about which is better, and I have my opinions, and I make those opinions clear in the book. But I think it's interesting food for thought to go back in time, because there's a lot we can learn from the past.
Well, I think that's also another, just not only the stories, the juxtaposition, but then also the fact that people of our generation have many common experiences, and just for one, seatbelts in a car.
Seatbelts in a car.
Everybody thinks there were seatbelts, Andrew, but your experience?
Right. Well, there were seatbelts in the car.
But they didn't use them.
But I literally didn't know one single person, not one single person who put on their seatbelt in the car. Nobody. And my father, he did what became the classic technique, because the government came out with a ruling there had to be a buzzer to let you know that your seatbelt wasn't fastened. Well, they knew their seatbelts weren't fastened. I don't want them fastened. So he buckled it together and stuffed it, between the seats. And his, thinking on that was, that'll show those government bastards. He was a very anti-government kind of guy. And so, yeah, we had seatbelts. Nobody thought to use them. My mom's way of seatbelts was, if we were coming to a quick stop, she would reach over.
The mommy arm.
Yeah, which does absolutely nothing in a true crash. Absolutely nothing. But, that was our version of seatbelts.
You know that as you shared these stories with your close friends, or as your close friends have read the book, has anybody come back to you and said, now I get you better?
Not yet, but I know it's coming. I know it's coming. Because the very first sentence in the book, and I wanted to start out with a bang, was, my first conscious memory is of being slapped in the face. That's a true story. And so I kind of expect when people who know me well read about that and other things, they're probably going, okay, now I get why this guy's so messed up. And nobody said it yet, but I know it's coming.
Well, let me be the first to say that, not that you're messed up, but as I read the book, I do believe I got a deeper understanding who Andrew Harvey is.
I'm sure.
But that's because I think you struck a good balance with telling as truthfully as you could and as candidly as you could within the context of the time, and through this rearview mirror we call life,
right.
that went through for you. Then you've talked a lot about giving a copy of the book to your mother, or your father.
Although I'd love for my mother to have had one.
Well, yeah, but I would also say your mother and my mother could have been sisters.
Oh boy.
So I mean, it's no cakewalk when you get back to Los Angeles, is it?
Not at all. And could I have written a memoir just based upon my time in Los Angeles? Probably. But I think what really makes the stories, as you pointed out, it's the juxtaposition. You have interesting stories in LA, without a doubt, with some characters that, as one reviewer said on Amazon, are a hoot. And that's putting it rather delicately. And a host of Southern California, characters who are somewhat crazy in their own right. One of the strangest things about my family is my grandmother was very much a stabilizing force for me, and she's the one the book is dedicated to. But the other close family members, they were all crazy. Every one of them was crazy. You think, wow, it must really run in your family. That's not the twist to it. The twist is they were crazy in completely different ways. The craziness and eccentricities of my mother were completely different than that of my father and that of my brother, and so on. And so if they had all been crazy in the same way, it would have been much easier to adjust to. But the fact that they were crazy in completely different ways as a child, I mean, it's kind of like you're playing like an NFL cornerback and you're constantly backpedaling, trying to figure out how to get your bearings. But I guess that's in part what makes the story fun and a roller coaster ride, because if they were all, you know, the parents on Leave It to Beaver, and that's a dated reference as well, then I don't know if it would be that interesting. It's interesting because these people are crazy.
Yeah,
And I had to live through it.
I would have been softer and at the same time harsher and said that they were eccentric, but that eccentricity is so magnified by the context of the distance and time.
Yes.
Because your father not using a seatbelt is completely, that's rational for the time.
Yes.
It's
In fact,
crazy.
they would have thought you were a nut. They would have made fun of you.
Yeah.
If I, as a kid, had fastened my seatbelt in the back seat, they would have made fun of me. Of course, they also smoked in the car, and so we would go on long trips. My father smoked a pipe, and his wife smoked cigarettes. So I'm in the back seat, no seatbelt, at least not one buckled, and it's like whatever the opposite of an oxygen tent would have been. That's what I was in. And I'll probably still develop lung cancer one of these days just from that.
So you're in a rolling hookah lounge with no
Yeah.
seatbelt, and I'll bet your father's driving 85 miles an hour in a 40.
And probably faster. He was a very fast driver, but he also took great pride in putting one past on the government. So being able to speed without detection, and he even had one of the first fuzzbusters, they call them, which is a radar detector, and he took enormous pride in this fuzzbuster. And it was kind of like a snake and mongoose thing that he played. But yes, we're driving 85, even if it was raining. The hookah lounge is going, no seat belts, and they just did whatever they want. And nobody once ever asked me, well, gee, Andy, what would you like to do? Gee, Andy, is the smoke bothering you? Gee, Andy, you know, what do you think? Never once that I can ever recall was my input solicited. The opposite of now, where you can't even go to CVS without some parents say, oh, well, Johnny, what would you like? Would you like this candy? And they're just catering to children like there's no tomorrow. It was different back then. Children were not, they were loved. Children were loved, but they weren't catered to like is the case now. Two different times.
In the book, you not only your father driving, your mother driving, there's how your grandmother gets around, which is not necessarily driving. There's a lot of this car metaphor going on where we're going somewhere, but you're not sure how we're going to get there or if we're going to get there. Was that consciously, or is that just a theme that came from the book? Because the car is a very strong metaphor throughout the book.
It was not conscious. It may have been subconscious, which by definition I probably couldn't articulate to you, but I see what you're saying and I agree. But my thinking in writing it was not so much to create that thread. If that thread was created, it was just created organically by the stories. Now granted, there's a specific chapter devoted toward driving issues called Driving the Car. And so during that chapter, it was a very conscious focus on cars. But I think the other references in that regard throughout the book were not conscious metaphors or analogies or anything of that nature. Those were things that just emerged organically as telling those particular stories.
One of the things that emerges for me, and I think this really is my last question, so I'll let you run with it. You in your childhood, and in a much different way, in mine, because we're contemporaries, we had to create our own play. There was no one who, the parents didn't sit down and play a game with you or instruct you. You were turned loose and you constructed play yourself.
Yes.
With your friends, you made games, you did things together, and you had pick-up sports games. Today the world, at least in our country, seems more structured in that way for children. Are we losing that? I mean, is a generation of children who have been so structured losing something, or are they gaining something we never had? Who's the winner or loser here?
Well, I personally think we've lost a lot. Now, that's not to say that the technological proficiency that our current children has isn't amazing. I think it is amazing. And they will do wondrous things that I couldn't even dream about doing. But that said, I think there is a downside too. I'm a big fan of the Apollo missions, and I talk about the moon landing in the book. And if you were to study the backgrounds of those great astronauts, part of that program, what you would find is they all came from small towns. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think particularly in small towns, back in those times, you kind of were left to your own devices as a child. And you were told to come home for dinner at a certain time, but you had to kind of make your own way in the world from a very early age. You had to learn to be independent. You had to learn to fend for yourself, to protect yourself, to find your way home if you were lost. We didn't have the GPS system to guide you home. All these sorts of things. And we didn't realize we were acquiring life skills at that point as we ran around the neighborhood and built teepees and figured out how to get one of our playmates out of the sewer. And yes, he really was in the sewer. That's a true story told in the book. We just kind of figured it all out on our own. And I think we were gathering phenomenal life skills by doing that. That children, the highly managed children of today, they're not handling those skills. They have highly structured play dates. Their parents have arranged for it. There'll be 2 hours and 15 minutes that will be used for this playtime here. Then we are going to soccer practice, and so on and so forth. And of course, all the interim time is spent with them ruining their spine and their neck by going like this. These kids now, when they're our age, they're all going to be like this with arthritic hands. That's a downside. So I think there are a lot of upsides for our kids now in terms of what they will do with technology or things that we couldn't even have imagined doing. But I do think there's a lot that's lost in terms of what kids really learned and the life skills they learned when they went out and played. And so I have those and you have those. And for the most part, our children now don't have those. The ultimate history will be written on that way down the line, probably after we're gone. But my intuition, my sense of it is we have lost a lot. And the book, I think, is a walk back in time to maybe examining some of those things that we've lost.
So, as you said earlier, the writer gets the last word. What's the last word?
Well, I've had a very, very happy, I think, successful life. And writing the memoir is a bit of a capstone on that. I wrote the book for a lot of different reasons, but one of those reasons was to try and create a little bit of a legacy. I think the characters, although they may have been crazy, they were my characters, and I loved them. And I wanted to, maybe in some small way, kind of immortalize them. And I think the book helps to do that. I even think of myself when I get to be an advanced age and maybe I can't really remember my childhood very much. Well, if I can still read, I can take out this book and I can literally relive my childhood accurately, even though maybe I don't actually remember it. But perhaps most of all, I have a daughter who's now 24. And my guess is if life goes as it does, there will be people in her life, relatives, children, grandchildren, etc., that maybe I never get to meet. And they'll hear about me, but they won't really be able to bring me to life. I hope that through this book, if she's kind enough to read those as maybe bedtime stories to tell them about me, maybe I can get to know them and they can get to know me a little bit through the book, even if I'm not around to read it to them. So I kind of like that idea.
Andrew J. Harvey, Tucker and Me.
Thanks, Raymond.
Hey, thanks for spending some time, Andrew.